We often find ourselves asking, why did they do it?
Yeah.
Why did someone commit that specific act?
Right. That's the standard question.
But what if, maybe, that's not even the deepest question, what if the real fundamental question is, why is that thing even considered it in the first place?
Interesting angle.
Welcome to the deep dive.
Mm-hmm.
Today, we're really jumping into the fascinating world of critical criminology.
Yeah, it's a big one.
It really is. It's a way of thinking that completely redefines how we understand crime and, frankly, society itself. It really turns a lot of assumptions upside down.
It absolutely does. And our goal today really is to unpack a whole stack of compelling sources we've got here, academic modules, research excerpts, you name it,
Right.
to really get a handle on this shift. We're exploring why critical criminology pushes us to ask, why does society define crime the way it does, instead of just zeroing in on why one person did one thing?
And to make that concrete, I mean, the sources give some great, maybe even provocative examples.
They do.
Like, instead of asking, why did Joe take, say, a psychedelic drug? Critical criminology asks, well, why is recreational drug use illegal at all?
Totally different question.
Or, why did Joe pirate episodes of The Bachelor? Becomes, why is media content organized and, well, controlled the way it is?
That's a system-level question.
Exactly. Or maybe the starkest one. Instead of, why did Joe steal an apple?
Oh.
It forces us to ask, why didn't Joe have access to basic food?
Oof. Yeah, that hits different.
So you can probably already tell this isn't just some dry academic exercise.
Not at all.
This is a fundamental change in perspective. It challenges our everyday gut-level assumptions about what's criminal and, crucially, why.
So, to really dig into the heart of critical criminology, we need to tackle its core idea,
Okay.
which is that there's no universal, fixed definition of crime. It's not. It's not set in stone.
Right, not like gravity.
Exactly. Instead, the whole concept of crime reflects a society's dominant beliefs, its values, and maybe most importantly, its power structures.
Power structures. Okay.
Yeah, and this idea comes straight from what's called social constructionist theory.
Social construction. Heard that term?
Right. It basically says crime doesn't have an objective, agreed-upon definition. I mean, think about it. Philosophical debates about what should be criminal have gone on for centuries.
But we still argue about it.
Exactly. There's no settled answer. It means the very thing we call crime, often treated as this objective reality, is actually something societies construct. They decide. It's not some timeless truth.
That's a huge reframe. And you see this playing out, right? I mean, the sources mention things like abortion or assisted suicide.
Yeah, perfect examples.
In some places, legal,
Mm-hmm.
reflecting individual control, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
In others, crimes, even seen as homicide.
Huge difference in values there.
Or look at same-sex marriage. One's criminalized almost everywhere, right, based on homophobic ideas.
Deeply ingrained ones.
And now, legally recognized, socially supported in many, many places.
It's a massive shift. And these examples, they really highlight how legal systems have historically been used, sometimes quite explicitly, to criminalize behaviors and even identities of marginalized groups.
So it's a tool.
It can absolutely be used as a tool to reinforce existing power structures, yes.
Okay, so what's the mechanism? How does critical criminology explain how this happens?
It draws really heavily on conflict theory.
Conflict theory, got it.
So conflict theory argues that a society's values aren't based on everyone agreeing.
Right, not some big happy consensus.
No, it says that in any society, you're going to have disagreements about what's right, what's wrong, what should be against the law.
Makes sense.
Therefore, the meaning of crime, what actually gets written into law, tends to reflect the most prominent values at a given time. Often, this means ignoring or even actively rejecting other values held by less powerful groups.
So if it's not consensus, how do we decide what's a crime? Who decides?
Well, this really underscores the idea that crime is fundamentally a political concept.
Political.
The formal definitions, the laws on the books, they tend to reflect the views of those who hold political power.
The ones who can influence legislation.
Exactly. They have the means, the access, the influence to shape laws. While groups with less power often have very little say in those definitions, it's less about universal morality and more about who gets to write the rules.
So how did this whole way of thinking develop? Where did it come from?
Well, you got to look at the historical context. After World War II, you had this period in Western nations, economic booms, pretty high trust in government, lots of optimism.
The good old days narrative, sort of.
Kinda, yeah. But that optimism started to really fray in the 1960s. You had the rise of civil rights movements, a growing, often painful awareness of just how deep inequalities still ran.
Right, people start seeing the cracks.
Big time. People realized society hadn't really dealt with the deep disagreements between different communities about culture, about values, about what should be considered crime.
So that must have shaken up criminology, too.
Oh, absolutely. Scholars started realizing, hey, these laws don't actually reflect agreement across the board.
They reflect conflict.
Exactly. Debates over things like recreational drugs, sex work, abortion, they just laid bare these massive
So
disagreements.
the focus shifted.
It did. Instead of just asking, why do people commit crime, criminologists started asking, wait, why did political leaders criminalize these actions and not others?
Focusing on the lawmakers.
Yes. How did they decide? How did the justice system choose to police certain things? And the conclusion they kept coming back to was political power.
Who got elected? Whose ideas got attention?
Whose votes counted? Exactly. That's what settled these conflicts, not some underlying moral agreement everyone shared.
So this is the core difference, then, between consensus theory and conflict theory. Can you break that down quickly?
Sure. Consensus theory was the older idea law reflects shared values. You know, everyone agrees murder is wrong. It's kind of comforting.
But it ignores all the arguments.
Pretty much. Critics said it just papered over all the political fights and disagreements. Conflict theory, on the other hand, says law isn't about universal agreement.
Okay.
It reflects the dominant political views of empowered groups, often ignoring or dismissing other perspectives. Think about gun control debates today.
Oh, yeah. Very political.
What counts as a crime related to firearms often boils down to which party's in power, whose values get prioritized in legislation. It's a clear example.
Makes sense. So conflict theory really took off in the 60s, but I guess these ideas had earlier roots.
Oh, definitely. You can trace them back. Like in the late 1930s, you had Thorsten Selin. He talked about conduct norms,
Conduct norms?
basically cultural rules for behavior. He argued that in diverse societies, you get conflict over these norms. Some get prioritized in law, others get rejected.
Okay.
Then in the late 50s, George B. Vold built on that with his group conflict theory. He saw society as groups constantly negotiating in this sort of dynamic balance.
Always shifting.
Right. For Vold, conflict was the core, not consensus. And crucially, he said privileged groups have the most sway over defining what crime is.
Which brings us right back to the late 60s in the U.S. Very fractured time, civil rights, Vietnam.
Exactly. Perfect ground for conflict theory to really gain traction. And that's when Austin Turk, in '69, developed his theory of criminalization.
What was his specific take?
He argued that when there's conflict, marginalized groups often challenge the dominant definitions of crime through protests, political action, whatever.
Pushing back.
Right. But then privileged groups might react by criminalizing those very political actions to maintain the status quo, using the law itself as a tool to keep social hierarchies in place.
Wow. Using the law to shut down dissent.
That's how it's interpreted within this
Yeah.
framework. And then by the 1980s, things got even more nuanced with pluralistic conflict models.
Pluralistic, meaning more than one group.
Exactly. These models recognize it's not usually just one single elite calling all the shots. Societies have various powerful groups.
With competing interests sometimes.
Often competing interests, yes, and their positions change. So the criminal justice system isn't just influenced by, say, the rich or white people or men, though those are factors. It's also influenced by conservative values, liberal values, even radical values, depending on the political winds.
So it's not just a simple powerful versus powerless situation.
It's more complex. It challenges that simple binary. And these different competing interests and power dynamics led to various branches within critical criminology, like the feminist and Marxist views we should probably get into.
Okay, great. So we sort of set the stage for how critical criminology flips the script on crime itself.
Yeah.
Let's dive into some specific applications. You mentioned feminist criminology. That seems like a really important one.
Hugely important. Its core is really about advocating for gender equality, identifying those deep-seated gender inequalities in society, and challenging patriarchal systems.
Patriarchy, this system where men tend to hold power.
Exactly. And feminist criminology emphasizes how concepts like femininity itself are socially constructed. You know, those traditional, often oppressive ideas linking women mainly to homemaking, not power roles.
Yeah.
Those aren't biological facts. They reflect patriarchal views that limit women's roles.
So how did this feminist critique develop within criminology specifically?
Well, it's interesting. Early on, you had liberal feminism looking at women's crime rates. They noted women committed less crime, not because of biology, but likely because their freedoms were so restricted.
Fewer opportunities for crime, maybe.
That was the idea. This
Oh.
led to the liberation thesis from Rita James Simon back in 75. She suggested, maybe controversially, that as women gain rights and opportunities, their crime rates might actually go up.
Hmm. Interesting hypothesis.
But then things took a more critical turn in the 80s. Scholars like Meta Chesney Lynn started asking a different crucial question.
Which way?
Why are crimes against women so often ignored or even decriminalized?
Focusing on victimization.
Precisely. She pointed to domestic violence, how it was often dismissed as just a household matter. Police might ignore it, leaving victims completely unprotected by the system.
That's a really powerful critique of what the system chooses not to see as crime.
Exactly. And today, feminist criminology is arguably a dominant force within critical criminology. It's done so much to expose what gets called male-stream criminology.
Male scream.
Yeah, the traditional male-focused perspectives that historically just ignored women's experiences, both as offenders and, crucially, as victims. It's really highlighted major hypocrisies in how the justice system treats women.
Okay, so that's the gender lens. Now, shifting from gender to class and economic power, we have Marxist criminology, rooted in Karl Marx's critique of capitalism, right?
That's the foundation. Marx saw capitalism as inherently oppressive, creating alienation, exploitation, massive class divides by forcing workers, the proletariat,
Or working class.
to sell their labor to the owners, the bourgeoisie, the elites.
So how does that translate to crime?
Well, the core Marxist criminological view is that criminal law tends to reflect the values and interests of the economic elites.
Not society as a whole.
Not primarily. While they'd acknowledge the justice system isn't always just a puppet of the rich, sometimes elites do get punished, they argue that overall, economic elites have a huge disproportionate influence on what gets defined as crime and how laws are enforced.
So the wealthy basically get to shape the rules of the game.
That's the argument. And a key point they make is that the rich can influence public perception. They can fund media, influence politics to focus attention on the crimes of the less powerful.
Street crime, petty theft.
Right. While conveniently ignoring or downplaying the crimes of the powerful.
Like white-collar crime, tax evasion, corporate fraud.
Exactly. And there's actually data cited in the sources that backs this up pretty starkly.
Oh, yeah. What does it show?
Well, Ryman, back in 1995, estimated the annual cost of street crime in the U.S. was around $18 billion.
Okay, sounds like a lot.
It is. But compare that to his estimate for the cost of corporate crime,
Which was,
closer to $1 trillion per year.
wow, $18 billion versus $1 trillion.
Yeah. The difference is just staggering, and it really highlights that selective focus where the police resources go, what gets prosecuted heavily versus what might fly under the radar.
That is quite a disparity. Now, Marxist criminology mainly focuses on defining crime, right? But does it also touch on why individuals commit crime, even if that's not its main goal?
It does, yeah. It offers explanations, but framed through that lens of capitalism. For example, Quinney in 1980 talked about crimes by the poor. He categorized them.
Okay.
You have crimes of accommodation. These sort of reproduce capitalist logic, like a teacher stealing a credit card to pay rent. They're working within the system's pressures to survive.
Trying to get by.
Then you have crimes of resistance. These challenge capitalist ideas, like maybe a computer scientist uploading pirated software that directly attacks notions of private property.
Pushing back against the system.
Right. And then, in contrast, you have crimes committed by the rich. These are called crimes of domination and repression.
And what do those do?
They actively reinforce capitalism and the status quo that benefits the wealthy. Think of a realtor lying about the quality of condos to make a bigger profit. That's exploiting others to maintain their dominant position.
So different types of crime serving different functions within that class structure.
That's the Marxist interpretation, yes.
Okay, so we've looked at the core ideas, the history, some major branches. Now let's try to evaluate critical criminology overall. What are its main strengths, logically speaking?
Well, logically, its biggest strength is highlighting how crucial it is to study politics and conflict if you want to understand crime definitions.
It forces you to look beyond just the act itself.
Exactly. It makes us question that assumed consensus about law. Why are these things illegal? It's a logical question once you accept that crime is socially constructed.
Right.
It also helps explain why definitions change over time, why they often seem to mirror the values of whoever's in power politically, and it explains the, well, hypocrisy we sometimes see in policing.
Focusing on certain crimes over others.
Yeah, so it's a very logical framework for understanding that constructed nature of crime.
Okay, those are solid points. But what about the other side? What are the main criticisms or logical flaws people point out?
Well, one common critique is that it can sometimes overestimate the link between power and crime definitions.
How so?
Critics point out that laws have been passed that address things like white collar crime, domestic violence, discrimination, things that arguably challenge the powerful.
So it's not always just the powerful getting their way.
Right. Suggesting maybe it's an oversimplification to paint it as a strict binary where laws only reflect elite interests. Another criticism is that it tends to rely heavily on abstract concepts.
Like power.
Exactly. Power, influence, dominant ideology. These can be really hard to pin down and measure scientifically.
How much influence do they really have? It's hard to test.
It raises questions about falsifiability, yeah. And maybe the most significant criticism is that it often doesn't fully explain why people actually commit the behavior in the first place,
It explains why it's called a crime.
but not necessarily the individual motivation for doing the act itself, though, as we saw it with Marxist theory, some branches do try to bridge that gap.
Gotcha. So logical strengths and weaknesses. What about empirical support? Does the evidence back up critical criminology's claims? How's its validity?
Actually, yeah, research provides pretty strong support for many of its core ideas.
Okay.
Studies consistently show a lack of public consensus on certain crimes, like abortion, drug use, sex work, while there is consensus on others, like murder.
Which supports the idea that definitions aren't universal.
Exactly. And even more compelling, there's just a mountain of data showing the often hypocritical way the criminal justice system actually functions.
You mean disproportionate impact?
Yes. Expensive research shows marginalized communities, particularly racial minorities, are far more likely to be stopped, detained, cited, arrested, or even harmed by police.
That brings us back to those chilling phrases. Driving while black.
Or running while black, standing while black. Those aren't just anecdotes. They reflect documented patterns. They powerfully illustrate how bias can operate within the system.
It's hard to ignore that evidence. It really suggests that, as the sources say, definitions of crime can reflect biased assumptions. And the very concept can be used, consciously or not, to disadvantage groups by linking their identities to criminality.
It points to systemic issues, absolutely.
Okay, so what about its usefulness, its utility? What practical value does critical criminology offer?
Its core value is huge, I think. It constantly pushes scholars, policymakers, the public, all of us, to re-examine how we define crime and how the justice system impacts different groups unevenly.
It keeps that question of power front and center.
Always. It insists that crime definitions aren't neutral. They're tied up with power structures, patriarchy, capitalism, racism, colonialism. Think back to feminist criminology.
Right, exposing ignored crimes like domestic violence.
Exactly. Those invisible crimes show how power shapes what even gets noticed, let alone punished. So it's not just about criticizing, it's really a call for transformation.
Transformation how?
By suggesting we need to redefine crime to include broader harm, systemic harms, things like environmental destruction, corporate negligence, racialized state violence, gender oppression. It expands the whole conversation about what justice should address.
But isn't there a critique about its practical use? I mean, detractors often say it's great intellectually, but doesn't give clear guidance for people working in the system day to day.
Like a police chief or a judge.
Yeah. What are they supposed to do with an abstract critique of capitalism when they have a case in front of them? Does its abstract nature limit its practical impact?
That's definitely a critique you hear, but critical criminologists have a response to that.
Okay.
They increasingly focus on praxis.
Praxis.
Applying theory to practice. So they get involved in activism, policy advocacy, developing alternative justice models, things like restorative justice, transformative justice, community-based programs.
Trying to build different approaches.
Exactly. Trying to bridge that gap between the theoretical critique and creating real-world reforms. It shows that while it might be less of a how-to manual than traditional criminology, it offers a vital framework for imagining and building justice beyond the current system's limitations.
So, wrapping this all up then, this deep dive into critical criminology, it really feels like it fundamentally shifts our perspective.
It really does.
It forces us to question these normalized definitions of crime we just accept, and to ask, do they really reflect shared values or well, more often, the interests of powerful groups.
And we have to acknowledge its limits, too. It doesn't give us one clear, simple definition of crime to replace the old ones.
Right, and it doesn't always explain individual behavior proactively.
And sometimes, yeah, it might oversimplify power into just the powerful versus the powerless.
But even with those limitations, its value seems immense. It's really exposed huge weaknesses in traditional, often mainstream ways of thinking about crime.
Absolutely. It forces us to look at the bigger picture, at the systems that create and define crime in the first place. It is. Yeah, it's a pretty mind-bending shift.
It really is.
So here's a final thought, maybe, for you listening. If the very concept of crime is, as critical criminology argues, a social construct shaped by power and history, what else? What other things in our society that seem objective, seem fixed, might also be products of power, of dominant beliefs? How might using this critical lens change how you view the world around you?